I have a very special show today. I feel very lucky to be in your presence. How are you doing, Lou?
Good. Actually, I feel equally lucky. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people in the world that want to speak to you, and here we are. We're going to have a chat. How,
I'm not sure necessarily all of them want to say nice things, but I appreciate it. The honor
well,
and
we're going to
privilege.
find out, aren't we? One way or the other.
Yeah, the honor and privilege is mine. Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
It's honestly surreal to have you sat here because for those of you who listen to my podcast, I had become aware of this kind of whole UAP thing from my brother, and he's one of the most kind of critically thinking, logically minded people. And as we discussed today, I found myself reaching a point where I thought, oh, damn, I'm really going to have to look into this now. And as fate would have it, I'm walking down the street in London, and there you are, just on the corner of the street.
Yeah, it was. That actually was my stunt double. Believe it or not. No, I'm kidding. It's little known fact. One of my wife and my most favorite cities in the whole wide world has always been London. My wife's family on her father's side is all from the UK, and I distinctly remember the first time I took her to London. It was kind of like going back home to the fatherland. And in fact, if you go to London Heathrow Airport in the B terminal and look at the floor, you'll see some what appear to be scratch marks, and those are the claw marks my wife made as I had to drag her back onto the plane back to the United States.
Come move over.
We're trying. We're trying.
Well, I found it as a genuine kind of strange turn of fate. I found that whole thing so peculiar, and it obviously explains a little bit of why we're here. I was fascinated by this subject, and for a lot of people, I would assume, who will be watching this, they'll be thinking, everyone in the world wants to seemingly talk to Luis Elizondo, and then here he is speaking to Mark Kovic on a small podcast, and I feel like the one thing I can try and get out of this conversation is the ability to just have a really honest, frank conversation with you, maybe ask you questions that the typical media wouldn't, maybe try and press you a little bit and see what's going on underneath, because
Sure.
as you know, I've been fascinated by this whole subject for a while. My first question to you is, can you define why you're doing what you're doing in this space? What is it that seems to be driving Luis Elizondo?
Wow. Good question. You're right. I don't think I've ever been asked a question like that. It's usually, what do I know? And, what do I think, but not really what motivates me. Some people may know, some people may not know. I'm a father of 2 children, been married for almost 30 years now. And what drives me to have this conversation is the same thing that drove me to join the military, to serve my country, go to war, in fact. It's loyalty. It's loyalty and patriotism to an ideal. My family came here as immigrants. My father was a political prisoner in Cuba. After the Bay of Pigs invasion, he went to prison for several years and endured some horrible atrocities as a result. Came to the United States, where he had opportunities that Cuba did not provide us, and he thrived. And I remember as a young child him always telling me, look, the United States is one of the best countries in the world, not because it gives you things, but it gives you the opportunity to achieve what you want to achieve, if you're willing to put in the work, right? It's not automatic. You don't just come to the United States and all of a sudden, presto, you get what you want. You have to earn it, and it's not guaranteed, but what you are guaranteed is the opportunity. And that's something that Cuba did not allow us to do. And so from a very young age, that was instilled in me, and it was a driving force to serve my country. And that led later on for me to get into the programs I did. I excelled in the intelligence community, and I did pretty well, I guess, by their standard, and eventually was promoted into a position that, that I think probably now is why, from a public perspective, people know who I am. But it was because of that opportunity that the United States gave me, and that's really what still drives me to this day, is that sense of loyalty to my nation, to my country.
The sense of loyalty to your country is what is driving you to expose information.
Yeah. I know it sounds a little weird. Maybe people say, well, isn't that kind of counterproductive? No, I don't think so. I think sometimes, loyalty is one of the things that's very hard to measure. And it's one of those things. There's an old saying: sometimes to be a patriot, you have to do things at the time that don't seem very patriotic. It's something that to me, I left the Department of Defense because I wanted to fix what was wrong in the government, not to destroy it, not to tear it down, not to break it down. That was never my intention. To basically use the system, the mechanisms that were in the system already, in order to have a very difficult conversation, a conversation that I knew would probably impact me professionally and personally, most certainly, and in every aspect of my life. It has not been an easy road.
And do you feel that what you're doing now is a means to rectify that and regain some control in that aspect? Is that
Well, I'm not seeking control. I'm seeking our government to work the way it was intended, which is controlled by the people, not controlled by Lou Elizondo, right? It's not, I don't have a private agenda here to gain anything out of it. My agenda is to fix what is broke and hopefully not break more of it in the process of trying to fix it. It's kind of like trying to fix your car. You've got a water pump that's broken, the engine's overheating, maybe a sticky valve and a blown out cylinder, but you have to fix it while you're driving down the highway. And that's not really easy, right? It's a little bit more complicated than just taking it to a shop.
I want to get into a lot of those cogs that you want to replace in this conversation, because I can understand a little bit more about what you mean. You don't just throw the car out because you don't like those certain parts.
Yeah, right. I don't think we can afford to do that. In fact, it's not a matter of wanting to throw the car out or not. The car works. The car was designed great. It's been driving great for a couple centuries now. But like any car, there are things that need to be repaired and need to be addressed. And ignoring that problem is not the solution. Burying your head in the sand doesn't make the problem go away. It just makes the problem worse.
Well, for my listeners who aren't aware of Lou's history, because obviously most people listening are, Lou was involved in, I guess we can call it whistleblowing, for lack of a better way. You came out and exposed a concern that things were happening in our skies, that there were potentially things that the government had come across that they weren't telling people, and you were directly read into these programs. And like I said, we're going to dive into that in a minute. But just before we start, I want to pretext this in a little bit of a different way, and I want to ask you a question about what you think your worst critics would say about you. So before we go into this debate a little bit, what is it that you think people say about you that's critical?
Well, that depends. Are we talking about the funny goatee that I sometimes sport, or my terrible sense of fashion?
I'm talking about what you're doing here, what your movement, what you're trying to get through.
It depends on where you're sitting. I have a lot of critics out there. Some are inside the government, some are outside the government. Some would say, for example, inside the government, that I'm not patriotic. I heard a conversation, I'll share this with you. Several of the attorneys from an organization called Aero, and I can go into a little bit more about what that is later on, but long story short, that's the organization that was basically replaced the program that I ran, AATIP, eventually. Some of the attorneys were having a frank conversation with some of the scientists that I work with and worked with in the past while at AATIP, and they said that I was unpatriotic and that I was hurting the Department of Defense and that I was considered a traitor. That cut very deep. From the outside of the government.
Why do you think that cut you so deep?
Well, because I like to think I'm the most patriotic person out there. I'm doing what I'm doing. In essence, I'm finishing the very job that I was given to begin with. And, the irony here is that the Department of Defense entrusted me to do a job. And in order to finish that mission, I had to leave the very department that I loved so much. I left to fix it. And that's
so you essentially quit in rebellion, in a way. You quit that position.
I resigned, and that's not unusual here in the U.S. government. For some of your listeners, I don't know how common this is in other countries, but here in the United States, especially in our military apparatus, if you can't fix a problem, you don't stay there and you don't make the problem worse. You resign. And so in 2017, in early October, I submitted my resignation to the Secretary of Defense. And by the way, I think it's important to note that the Secretary of Defense a year later did exactly the same thing. He resigned in protest because he was not getting the support he needed to do his job from the administration at the time. So it's not uncommon people resign in protest. As a military person, what you don't want to do is make a problem worse by staying there and creating internal issues.
I understand.
So
So one of your biggest critics, you would say, would be someone that says you're not loyal to your country. What else is there? Is there any other argument that you sort of...
Yeah, there's a lot. From the outside, a lot of times I've been accused of being it's a term we use here in the U.S. called grifter or grifting.
Yep.
It's someone who is trying to profit or profiting off of a particular topic, and that's their primary motivation. They don't really have any expertise in anything, but they find an opportunity to exploit, and they try to gain financially from that, exploit that situation.
Well, I mean, I can have some respect for that argument. I mean, in the sense that you are someone with a growing following. I've been very interested in your insights and the information that you expose. And I can understand that a lot of people would look at that and say, well, hold on a second. What if this guy is loyal to his country and he's going out and he's doing all of these things for the betterment of us as a functioning, law-abiding society? Why would he feel the need to charge money for, say, releasing a book or releasing films or documentaries? And I can understand that argument. So it's fascinating that that's one of the first things that you come into, because it is a good question.
I'm happy to address it now, and if it comes up again, we can continue to address it if you want. But the long story short is I've been engaged in this now for almost 7 years at great personal cost and almost financial ruin. If I was a businessman, this is probably the worst business decision anybody could ever make. Money has never been my motivation. There were times where my wife and I literally had to sell one of our kids' cars and leave our house and live in an RV, a trailer, for a couple years, simply because I was trying and still continue to try to do the right thing. Now, the question is, what's the right thing? Well, it's trying to bring attention to, I don't want to say malfeasance, because I think malfeasance is probably a harsh word, but dysfunction. Mm-hmm. There is dysfunction within the U.S. government involving a particular topic, which I'm sure we're going to get into, that is, in my opinion, a topic that every American and frankly the world probably should be made aware of, a topic that is real, a topic that affects every single one of us equally, although differently. And it's something I have dedicated my life to. And now, so back to your question, about grifting and making money, I haven't really made any money off this. The only time
but you're about to. And this is kind of like the friendliest way of, obviously we've spoken about this, me and you in general anyway, because I've been fascinated by your journey. But I want to put myself in the position of so many people that would just want to look you in the eyes and ask you these direct questions, because it's like, I want to kind of be as mean as I can because it's not in my nature, but I'm so desperate, genuinely so desperate for as much solidly grounded, concreted truth and honesty on this matter, just because I've been so confused by it. Mm-hmm. And I know that there's going to be people out there just a bit confused. Why a book? Why is he now monetizing it? So, like, just on the specific element, how do you feel about the fact that you will now be monetizing this thing? This will be putting dollars in your pocket.
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't have any issues with making a profit. I think that is, here in the United States anyways, we are a capitalist country, and it's very, very common for people to leave the government and then talk about their experiences in a book. But that's not my motivation, and let me be clear about that. One thing is to make money tangentially off of something. Another thing is to make money, and that's your only motivation. That is not my motivation here. My motivation here, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to complain that I'm going to actually pay some bills with this finally. But in reality, writing a book gives somebody an ability to put your thoughts down in a way that no one can take and manipulate or make a clever soundbite off of. Most people know I do a lot of interviews and have done a lot of interviews in the past, but these are interviews, especially with major media outlets, that are usually 5 minutes or less, and you have a little bit of a soundbite, and most of the time they already have a question they want to ask you. The book is an ability for me to address the things that I find important, the things that I think need to be addressed involving this big particular topic, and in a way that is in my voice, right? No one's putting words into my mouth. It's uncensored, unfiltered. What you see is what you get. And that's very important because it's authentic. You're hearing it directly from me, from my brain down onto paper, and it's also indelible. Please don't get me wrong. Podcasts are wonderful and interviews are wonderful. But books are forever. Books are tangible. Books are something that can sit on a bookshelf and generation after generation can read it. And there's nothing, unless you're going to burn every book in America, which, good luck with that, it becomes indelible. It becomes a permanent record for the times. And it is something that allows me to address all the issues that I think need to be addressed that I wouldn't normally have an opportunity in the time to do. For example, this podcast, no matter how long we sit here, unless you're prepared to sit here for the next month and a half, 24 hours a day, I'll never be able to get that.
I'm ready.
I'll never be able to.
If I can get to the bottom of this, I'm ready. But can this book, is it as simple as just your word on paper? Because can someone like you just release a book? Is there not a process behind how that has to work? Surely you can't just...
Well, sure you can. I can release a book on Amazon, but there's a couple issues with that. First of all, let's talk about the legal implication. Because I have a national security clearance, still, I have a top secret clearance, and I am still, it's a lifelong obligation to what we call a non-disclosure agreement, or in this case, secrecy oath, right? You swear an allegiance to the country and a promise to maintain those secrets. So there are certain things I am not allowed to say, and those things involve classified information. So my book, first and foremost, has to go through a review process. If I were to just put it out on Amazon and I fail to go through the Pentagon for that legal review, I can find myself very quickly in a lot of trouble, i.e. I could go to jail because they have not had a chance to review that information for classified information.
I didn't know that.
There's another piece to this, though, too.
Okay.
Because you're asking me something that I think has two parts to it. The other question is, why don't I just self-publish? By now, people know I'm going through HarperCollins, a major publisher. If you self-publish, most people don't have the resources, certainly I don't, to get the word out to a huge audience. The only people that are going to read a story like that on Amazon are people that are already following the topic, right? So right now on Twitter, I have maybe, 100, 200,000 followers, right? That's a drop in the bucket when you're talking about a global audience. When you go with a major publisher, they have the capability and resources to get the word out and really get the book out to a global audience. So rather than maybe 100 or 200,000 people that are going to read the book, it could be 10, 15, 20 million people that are going to read the book in different languages, right? So now that word spreads beyond just the English language, beyond just the shores of the United States, and beyond the, if you will, the horizon of those who are interested in the UFO or UAP topic, to a other mainstream audience that would otherwise remain untapped if I were to just go ahead and self-publish and say, here's my memoir and put it out. I don't have that type of infrastructure. I don't have that capability. I don't have those resources to reach the larger audience, which is really my intended audience. The people in that small UFO, UAP enclave, they're not my target audience. They already have their opinions. Either they believe it or they don't. And there's really little anybody can do to change that. My focus is the 99.9% of other individuals who may have never even really considered this topic before as being a serious topic to discuss.
Okay. Firstly, I didn't know that about the review process. And then that kind of brings another question in my mind, because on the one hand, you've said, this is my words, this is my process, this is my stuff going down on paper. But I can only assume that there's been a lot of redactions. If that's had to go through a process to be vetted by the security services, essentially, of the United States government, there's going to be things that you can't just openly say whatever you want.
Correct. And you're
so I'm sorry for jumping in, but will we as readers just see like blanked out lines of redaction in the book, or?
Yeah, but isn't that interesting, right? If you have a government that has historically said there's nothing to see here, the topic isn't legitimate, and there's no UFO program, and all of a sudden you read a manuscript where the government has redacted paragraph
And
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 line.
you'll print the redaction elements that where you can see you've written stuff, but it's
Absolutely. Anybody can look at those lines and see for themselves. I did not doctor those. Those are the lines that the U.S. government has said this is too sensitive.
Mhm.
You cannot publish it. And that will be there for everybody to see.
Okay. Well, that then brings me on to one of the main key points that I've always wanted to discuss with you in person and look in your eyes whilst we do it, because it bothers me genuinely that whenever I watch interviews, whoever we talk about, Grush or David Grush, I can't think how you pronounce it exactly because I know that's been floated around a couple of different ways, but I see people like him going in front of Congress and making certain claims, and then the second that it gets to the point of saying, okay, well, have you seen, have you touched, have you been involved with directly non-human intelligence craft, UAPs? There's this consistent, like, almost get out of jail free card that's played all the time, which is, I can't talk about that. I can't talk about that. Oh, I can't confirm or deny. And I know that if that irritates me as much as it does, there's going to be a million people out there being like, exactly. So I can understand from your point of view. You say, well, I can't just release information. I have to think about it. I have to put it in a manuscript. I then have to go and get this sent off to the Department of Defense, is it correct? The DoD?
Yeah, the Pentagon, correct.
I have to have that cleared. And really, I want this to go as far as and wide as possible, because what my actual mission here is to get as many people aware so we can actually change elements in the government so we kind of don't have this problem in a way. And my next question that I'd pose to you is, you open this podcast saying that one of the worst critiques you could have is to say that you're not loyal. Loyalty is obviously something that is a nerve toucher for you. It means a lot to you. Now, what would you say to people who would suggest, well, who are you loyal to here? Because why are you listening to these redactions and you're having your word, your freedom of speech redacted and taken away by fundamentally the government, and you have this information that you're not telling the people, when your loyalty is, of course, with the people? Like, do you have kind of some, I guess, what's the best way of putting it? A little bit of contradiction there, do you feel? Do you battle with that yourself?
I don't. And here's, simply put, you can't separate in this country the people from the government. The government is the people. The people are the government. This is a government for the people and by the people. And as long as we all agree,
one's saying, Lou, you can't say that, and the other's saying, Lou, tell us. So you have to pick a side, no?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a misnomer. I don't think you have. It's not an either or solution. In fact, the third option is to do exactly what I'm doing now: have the conversation without having to break my promise to the American people that I was going to safeguard their secrets, national secrets, and that's precisely what we're doing. There's been other attempts in the past. I do not believe in leaking classified information. I think that only hurts our country. I've never been one to I've had a lot of people say, well, Lou, just tell us the truth. Well, I am telling you the truth without having to break my national security oath, because it is important for people to realize, at least from my perspective where I come from, this government is all we have here in the U.S., and it's a government that we all agree should be there. It does wonderful things, and most of the time it works fantastic. I don't believe in breaking the system down or violating laws in order to provide information or to fix the very system that I'm trying to fix. I don't think you have to do that. And in fact, if the last 6 years have been any evidence of that, I think it shows that we can do that. Look, in the last 6 years, 7 years since I first come out, the first reaction was, oh, that's crazy talk. Now you have members of Congress saying it's real, former directors of the CIA saying it's real, former directors of the National Intelligence saying it's real, former secretaries of defense saying it's real, and you have former presidents of the United States saying it's real. Now, that has all happened lightning fast. Now, I know people have this natural burning desire, this curiosity that they want to know. Say, Lou, you have all this information in your head. Just tell us. But that's not why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm not out here to satisfy people's just idle curiosity. I'm out here so we can fix the very system so you don't have to ask me You can ask the government and the government will tell you.
Well, let me give maybe an example that strikes to the core of this. I know a lot of people just want to shake your hand and be like, the fact that you are willing to stick your head above the parapet, go there and say it. A lot of the things that have been released that are in the public domain now are thanks to you. There's a lot of people that want to tip their hat to you. So I want to make that clear.
I appreciate it. There's a lot of people too that probably want to punch me in the nose too.
But in my bones and in my soul, transparency and honesty is about my only guiding light and factor that is really important to me. And as soon as I met you, I looked at you as someone that I thought in my bones, this guy doesn't seem to be disingenuous.
Well, I appreciate it, but let me interrupt you for a moment if I can. This is part of the problem because it should not be up to one person that people look to and say, that guy has the truth. Therein lies the problem because people make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes, you make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes. This is indicative of a much bigger problem. The system is broken in this particular aspect and must be fixed because we cannot allow one human being, myself or someone like Dave Grush, to be the torchbearer here. We're doing it now just till the problem's fixed, but I promise you, once that problem is fixed, I plan to set off into the sunset. This is a mission for me because I believe in our country, I believe in our government, I believe in our people. But I also understand too, this is not and never has been the Lou Show, and it shouldn't be the Lou Show. This is what I've been trying to communicate all these years, and the more voices we have to have this conversation, the more that the government gets involved, the less it becomes the Lou Show. And I really do appreciate when people come up and they want to shake my hand in the airport and say, Lou, thank you for all you're doing. I appreciate that.
Well, the thing is, I was kind of setting you up for a curveball, right? Because I want to show my respect and my genuine kind of admiration for what you're doing. And then what I was going to move on to was Grush. And it's funny that you mentioned him because let's take, for example, the situation where he's in front of Congress and he's outright saying to everyone on broadcast that we have non-human intelligent craft that have crashed on Earth and we have recovered bodies. So that's not necessarily just the Lou Show anymore. These are other people that are coming out and saying this. You know David.
I do know David very well.
So you can surely confirm or deny that.
No, what I can say is he's an outstanding human being, but I will never speak on behalf of Dave Grush. If you want to know what Dave Grush thinks, I think you should have him probably here on your podcast and ask him directly because he is his own man and he's had his own experiences.
But you must have had similar experiences.
Well, I must have had. What does that mean? Similar experiences, if you can, because I'm not. Your definition of similar may be a little bit different than mine. What do you mean?
Maybe we can cut to the chase, and I can ask you: are you aware yourself? Forget David Grush for a minute. Of non-human intelligence on this planet.
Rather than tell you a yes or no answer, because and I'm going to explain to you why. Okay. I'd rather tell you what I do know for a fact. Okay, what I do know for a fact is that there are things that are operating in controlled U.S. airspace and globally that are performing in ways that we simply can't match today. And when I say we, not only the United States, but as far as we know, any other adversarial nation out there. So what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a whole bunch of different possibilities. Now, there are certain aspects of this conversation I cannot discuss. And the reason is because I have signed a security agreement with the United States government, which is basically a contract that says if I reveal anything about X, Y, or Z, I can and I will go to jail. And, of course, the next part of the conversation that people always say, well, if this is such an important topic, Lou, aren't you willing to go to jail? And my response is, I don't have to go to jail if we do this the right way. I don't want to go to jail.
But it sounds to me like that was a long way of saying, yes, there are non-human intelligences, and yes, what Dave Grush said is correct. I just can't talk about it.
Well, you can interpret it any way you want. But
am I interpreting it correctly, or
what I can say is I cannot confirm nor deny that question that you're asking me, and so that is a very common parlance in U.S. government speak. If there is a topic that of a certain sensitivity that we are not allowed to discuss, whether yes or no, right or wrong,
Mm-hmm.
that is the statement that we have to provide. And by the way, let me say this too. I completely understand and sympathize you chomping at the bit and your listeners wanting to know the answer. I want to give you the answer 100 times more than you want to get the answer. I promise you. It is very frustrating for me to sit here and look at you in the eye and have this conversation, and knowing that listeners are listening, and I have to provide answers that may appear to be evasive, but it is not intentional. But I have taken an oath to my country, and that oath is sacred to the point where I've been willing to go to war several times for it. It is something I'm willing to die for. It's a matter of principle, and I am not going to break that oath. It's no different than being married. When you look at someone in the eye and you say, I do, till death do us part, that is a lifelong contract. You can't just once in a while break that promise, say, well, except for Sundays at 6 o'clock at night when I'm with the boys at the bar. It doesn't work that way. It's either a promise that you take serious or you don't. And I happen to take that promise very, very serious.
Well, it goes back to what you said at the start. And I actually, maybe a penny dropped in my mind, because I've always looked at you, rightly or wrongly, as a little bit kind of anti-establishment, anti-government, which is kind of wrong, really, because you're not necessarily against the government systems. You might be a whistleblower, but if I've understood you correctly, what you're saying is you want to abide by the legislation and the law that we have in this country, because obviously we're in the US now, not in London, but you want to abide by the infrastructure that this country has. You don't want to break laws, and you're trying to do this in a potentially a slower way, and that leads me on to say the question I just asked you that you cannot answer. Do you think you will soon? And if so, how soon do you think you could confirm or deny that?
Well, so let's unpack that a little bit, because you actually asked me a few things in that. First of all, you're asking me to anticipate when I'll be able to tell you an answer to the question you're asking me. I have no idea. That's not my decision. That's to the U.S. government. And if we do this properly, you won't have to ask me, because the government will tell you. So that's first thing. Secondly, as far as being anti-establishment, what I am is anti-corruption. I'll share with you a very simple anecdote I had. My father recently passed away. He passed away on Father's Day of this year. My father and I were very close. And my father was very, very smart. And I asked him, and I feel a little guilty about this, because I asked him actually flippantly. We were driving in a long car drive down from my home in Wyoming down to Florida. So I had several days with him, and I knew he was sick. He was dying, and he didn't want to tell me, didn't want to worry me. But my background in medicine, I knew he was on his last few weeks of his life. And I said, Dad, what is the greatest threat to any society? And I asked him that because, I spent my life in counterterrorism and counter-narcotics and all these things. And what is it? And he looked at me, and without hesitation, he said, corruption. And I thought for a moment. I said, Dad, what do you mean corruption? Like monetary corruption? He said, no, corruption. Whether it's governmental corruption, political corruption, religious corruption, moral corruption. The moment one is willing to bend their own personal values in exchange for something else, whether it's money or drugs or sex or whatever, popularity and whatnot, that erodes the very foundation till eventually there's nothing left. And so corruption in government, and I don't mean necessarily monetary corruption, I mean corruption where the system is supposed to do one thing but decides to do something else because the truth is either inconvenient or it is embarrassing or for whatever reason, that is a form of corruption. And that keeping truth, ultimately truth away from people is, I think it is egregious. I think it is one of the worst sins a government could ever do to its people, because let's not forget, at least here anyways, this is a government for the people and by the people. You cannot separate government from people. People like to do that and say, oh, that's the government. Well, don't look now, but that's actually a reflection of you. Those people are there in office because either you put them there or because you didn't vote and let someone else put them there. But either way, ultimately, we are responsible. And that's not just Congress, okay? Because with presidents and they appoint cabinet members and whatnot. So there's a huge cascading effect here. And so ultimately, if you want to know why we don't have truth, we have only but to look in the mirror and blame ourselves, because we have not put the right people up there to tell us the truth. And I know that seems a little bit, some people say, oh, well, that's, so to pick the president, I'm responsible for that. Well, in a very kind of indirect way, yeah, because we have rights in this country that allow us to choose our elected officials. And that is sacred. Very few countries really allow that to happen. And so when we allow it to be hijacked by people who have different intentions, right, that are not consistent with the values of the people, then you have corruption. And what happens is we have the issues that we have now. And now, by the way, not just with UAP, there are a whole slew of issues we have in our own government right now that need to be fixed. They need to be addressed, they need to be fixed, and they need to be fixed now.
Well, it sounds to me, if I'm going to try my best to read between the lines, because there's a lot to unpack in that, but it sounds as if you're saying you do know about crash retrieval and non-human intelligences. You can't confirm or deny that. But to me, the fact that you instantly jump into this pillar, if you will, of your ideology, which makes sense to me, is that you're seriously concerned about corruption. There's not a very long line that needs to be drawn between those 2 points. It sounds to me like you're saying our government absolutely does have these craft, does have these retrieved bodies, and your worry is that that is just simply being shrouded up and covered up and hidden, and like you said, through embarrassment, through not wanting to admit certain things, they're just keeping that from the people. Does that sound about right?
Well, I got to hand it to you, you're very tenacious. No, that I did not say that. You can interpret what you want, but I did not say that the U.S. government is in possession of crash retrievals and biologics and bodies. That's your interpretation, and the lack of information that I'm providing, you're filling in that blank. Now, you're more than welcome to do that, because again, I understand that my response wasn't very. It was rather ambiguous, right? So I can neither confirm nor deny, and that's going to be up to you to interpret and your listeners, until at which point other people provide that information in a legal way, or I will. And the moment, I will tell you, the very moment the government can say, Lou, tell them what you know, I will be the very first person to get on the highest mountain with the biggest, loudest speaker, and you're going to know everything that I know.
Well, that's what I find quite cool about the conversations we've had, because the 3 videos, the 3 videos that came out recently that were put in the public domain, that was you that pushed for that and got that across.
Well, yes and no. I was part of the review process. I requested the review process. These were unclassified videos. At least those sections were unclassified. And so even though it was unclassified, I still didn't have the ability to pull them out of DOD. I had to go ahead and facilitate the process through what we call the 1910 process, have them reviewed, and then when they came back to me, said, yes, these are approved for release, you're good to go. The intent was then for us to go out into industry. When I say industry, the military industrial complex, where there is a huge resource pool of scientists and experts that could look at these videos and tell us what we're looking at. Because the scientists that we had at the time gave us their best shot, their very best estimate, and still at the end of the day, we came up with a big goose egg. We had no idea, despite all the different signatures we had of all the different aircraft of the world, and missiles and rockets and helicopters and drones and satellites and you name it. None of them matched. And so the question is, okay, what are we looking at? And so the idea was then to take that information, find some people out there, maybe in the Northrop Grummans of the world and the Lockheeds, and say, look, we've got this problem. What the hell are we looking at, right? And that was the original intent. However, the videos wound up later being provided to the media. For the record, I did not do that. I did not provide them to the media. I did not know they were going to go to the media. But they wound up in the media. And honestly, probably for the better, because now people have tangible evidence that the U.S. government has things in our airspace. We don't know what they are. Pilots are seeing them. We're picking up on radar. And we had a UAP, or in the vernacular, a UFO program in the Pentagon that was studying these things.
Well, this is where we get to talk about some more kind of factual things, which I'm excited to go into. And it's of course, there's an irritation for people like me, and there's an itch that needs to be scratched, right, to get the answers that you clearly know, that you clearly can't confirm or deny. But I have to say, one thing that's good about this conversation is probably for me and people like me to at least understand a little bit more about the framework of this stuff. And that leads me on to a couple of questions. Now, I want to talk about things like the Nimitz case and some of these videos that you've helped push forward. But there are a couple of typical things that I've had in terms of questions. When I said, "Hey, look, if you had the chance to speak to Luis Elizondo, what would you ask him?" One of them is to try and understand a skiff a little bit more, because when you're asked these questions, or when it comes to recovered craft and biologic crash retrieval, there's often something that is said where people go, "Well, look, I can talk to you about this in a skiff." So how does this function? What does it do?
Sure.
The question I asked you, are you allowed to speak about that in a skiff, for example? How does it work?
Yeah. So let me give you a little lesson on the U.S. classification system. Okay. There are 3 tiers of classified information. The lowest tier, but it's still classified, is confidential information, okay, which is, if you look at the definition, basically can cause, if this information gets out, it can cause damage to U.S. national security. The next level of classified information in the U.S. classification system is secret information. And that is, if this information gets out, it will cause great damage to U.S. national security. Then you have the third tier, the highest tier, the most sensitive, which is called top secret information, which would cause, according to the definition, grave damage to the U.S. national security apparatus if this information was released, right? So those are the 3. Now, these 3, if you will, kingdoms of classification have actually these little sub-kingdoms that live inside of them. So, for example, you can have secret collateral, you can have secret releasable information to certain countries that have the same security clearance. The same thing with top secret. And then within top secret, you have these, if you will, families of caveats. You can have a top secret clearance, but not have what we call SCI clearance, sensitive compartmented information. So a lot of people like to think of it as above top secret. It's really not. It's just a subcategory of top secret information. And then you have this whole, if you will, ecosystem of something we call SAPs and CAPs, which are special access programs and controlled access programs.
Such as AATIP? That would be a special access program?
So we'll get to it. So great question. So we're going to get to it. But first, let me explain, if I can, to you the macro level of how the security system works. Okay. So, and what you're asking me now is a little bit of a history in AATIP, which I can get to, but I think what you're asking me is a little bit of what a skiff is. So let me answer the question for you, and then we can go into AATIP if you like. So if you want to have have a conversation, or you want to do work on a computer, let's say, about information that is top secret, you obviously can't just do it in the halls of the Pentagon, because there's people there that are having tours, and a lot of it's unclassified, and not everybody has access to top secret information, right? So you have to do it in a facility or a location that is cleared to have that conversation, meaning there's no windows. You might have some shielding in the building as well. The doors are insulated, so sound doesn't travel beyond. Certain electronic emissions don't penetrate and can be picked up elsewhere, right? So they're special, just like a recording studio. Think of a skiff just like a recording studio. If you want to make a soundtrack in a recording studio, you don't do it in someone's garage, right? You go into a place that is specifically designed to have the best quality sound and the best recordings and whatever video that you want to do and the best engineers. That's kind of like a skiff. A skiff is like a recording studio, but for top secret or classified information. So you have these designated areas. So if I wanted to have a conversation with somebody about this topic, first of all, I'd have to do it in a skiff. Second of all, I'd have to make sure that the person I'm talking to, even though they might have the commensurate level security clearance, like top secret SCI, LMNOP, for example, that's not a real caveat. I'm just giving you an example. They would have to have a need to know. And I'd have to verify that too. So it's not just making sure you have a top secret clearance. It's not just making sure we're in a skiff. It's also making sure that you have a demonstrated need to know to have access to this information. So that is what a skiff is. That is when you hear the word skiff. It means special compartmented information facility. I'm sorry, sensitive compartmented information facility. Now, back to what you were asking me about AATIP specifically. If you want to ask me the question, I'll see if I can answer that for you. So you said something about AATIP.
Well, I think AATIP confuses me a little bit in the sense that this was a government-funded operation for the main mission of understanding UAPs. because it was acknowledged that there were things zipping around in our airspace. And then they decided to get a whole bunch of money together and go, right, let's get a department essentially to go and figure out what this stuff is.
Actually, let's get a few people in the department to do this. People that have the requisite qualifications in aerospace technology and whatnot to look at this.
And you led this.
I did. I initially came in 2008. In 2010, I became the director of it because of my seniority and my rank and my position. And for the following 7 years, I ran it as the director or chief, call whatever you want.
How does it feel when people within the government deny that, or when people in general deny that that program even existed? Yeah. Because at this point, it's not even a argument, right? You were there, you did it, you ran that program.
Right? Yeah. I mean, it's anybody who says it now is a bit misinformed, unfortunately. I think there was some confusion from the department because the department initially was very clear. When I first came out for 2 years, they said, yeah, AATIP was real. It studied UFOs, and Lou was in charge. And then something very interesting happened. After Secretary Mattis left the Department of Defense and resigned, a way I can describe it is that a new mindset took over the department because they had been inundated with so many requests and FOIA requests for the program. My boss at the time, I'm not going to mention his name here, but it is publicly known who he is, was very mad at me. And he was mad at me for several reasons. One, because I never read him into the program. And there's a reason for that. I don't want to say it here on the radio, but the bottom line is there were reasons that I felt I could not read in my current boss. There were some things going on in the department that I could not take a chance doing that. So instead of reading him in, his boss and his boss's boss were all read in. So I was briefing the Secretary of Defense's senior staff on a weekly basis, but I could not read in my supervisor. And when I left, my supervisor was very mad because initially he took it very personal. Mm-hmm. He was later removed from that position, and it became evident why. And he had started the campaign to tell people that AATIP wasn't real and I had nothing to do with it and that I was crazy. Fortunately, the program's sponsor, Senator Harry Reid, who happens to be the former Senate Majority Leader and the actual owner of AATIP, the person who started the program, wound up writing a letter for the record, and I believe it's dated 2021.
I've seen that, yeah, where he confirms it in
writing. He confirms it in writing, saying, look, I hate to tell you this, guys, I ran the program, and it's real. We studied UFOs, and Lou was running it for me, and he did a great job, right? I could have much earlier on fought that if I wanted to with the Department of Defense. There were people in the Department of Defense that knew exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it and who I was doing it for. But I could not, to save my own skin at the time and my own reputation, I would have had to expose them. And I wasn't willing to do that. So I took a lot of arrows for a long time. But yes, now I think the general consensus is, unless you look at, social media and Wikipedia and crap like that, but that's a whole other story. But the reality is, yes, it is a real pro. And now the government admits it. In fact, there was a sworn statement a sworn testimony by the Undersecretary of Defense recently, who told Congress officially and formally, when they was asked a question by Congressman Gallagher, I believe at the time, out of Florida.
I was going to ask you about this because I've seen this too.
Yeah. They asked him point blank, have you looked at any other UFO programs in the Department of Defense? Mm-hmm. And he said, well, we looked at Project Blue Book and we looked at AATIP, right? So
that must have been a vindication for you.
Well, it's never been about vindication for me. I've taken.
I guess in some ways it's just part of the problem that you're exposing.
It is exactly right, because in one hand the government says there's nothing to see here, folks, and on the other hand says, yeah, we looked at the program and it was a UFO program. I mean, so again, it just highlights, and it's actually not a vindication for me. It's sad. It's embarrassing. This is my government, and you can't even get your own facts straight. What the hell is wrong? I mean, the moment I left the Department of Defense, I'll share this with you. This is not public knowledge. I think a few people are aware of it, though. There is, because of one of the other portfolios I have, there is a standing order from a court of law. It's called a preservation order. Because of the work I was doing on another portfolio, all of my emails, all of the work I've ever done on certain computer systems while I was at AATIP are to be preserved by law because they are considered evidence evidence for a particular court case that the government's involved in. I'm not going to talk about that now. It doesn't deal with me, but the bottom line is I was involved in that. In direct violation of that court order, every single one of my emails and files were deleted from the Department of Defense servers. Poof, like they never existed. That is troubling because that means someone, this topic is so sensitive to someone in the department that they're willing to violate U.S. law to erase all of my files. Now, think about that for a minute. You are willing to sacrifice a national level court case on a national security issue, willing to completely compromise that because you don't want this guy, Luis Elizondo, revealing the information he has, right? You're going to do whatever you can to cover it up and say nothing to see here, folks. So now you're getting into the area of real conspiracy, not conspiracy theories. Like, hey, someone made a decision to do that so nobody else would find the truth. So it's compounding the problem. And so this is one of my greatest fears that we continue to see here. There are elements within the U.S. government that I don't think are serving the best interests of the people here in the United States, the citizens of the U.S. And they are making unilateral decisions and violating law, breaking the law, the very law that they expect us to follow in order to cover up their misdeeds.
Does that touch a nerve with you because of your loyalty and your willingness to follow the law in these difficult positions? Does that annoy you? That
Well, yeah. I mean, look, if
it feels like it touches it.
If the government, look, I mean, we left the same crap in Cuba. This is why we came to the U.S., right? When the government says, for thee but not for me, these laws apply to you but not us. Well, guess what? That's not a democracy anymore. That's a
but you still have
tyranny.
You still have hope that they're just shaky cogs that can be replaced and fixed, or do you think that the whole system really needs a bit of a revamp?
Well, I think it needs a tune-up. I don't think we need to. I don't think we need to sell the car or throw it in the junkyard. The car still works. It does a lot of good things. I think it just needs to be repaired.
Well, one thing that is really hard to wrap my head around is, let's assume that you're spot on here, and we have this kind of corruption issue, and then we have these very worrying things about deleting files and keeping everything hush hush. This stuff is not small anymore. I don't want to dive into the Nimitz too much because so many people out there are aware of the Nimitz. If you haven't been aware of that story, look it up. To do a 10-second summary, this is F-18 pilots had eyes on a UAP, tic-tac, as we call it, multiple radar systems all following it. It's one of the most fascinating pieces of kind of relatively conclusive evidence, if you will, that there's a real thing seen by people, trained observers. And that's just like one grain of sand in a complete beach of these pieces of evidence.
That's correct.
There's 3 videos that people are aware of. It's the Tic Tac, the gimbal, and
Go Fast.
And Go Fast. How many of them are there roughly? Like, do you think, as if you were guessing?
Let's just say a lot. I cannot provide an exact number.
But
a lot of these for me.
For all of us listening, loads. So this is hundreds.
And this is just in recent. So you're referring to the Tic Tac, as you say, story. It was actually a full field investigation. It was a full-blown investigation that was conducted by the Department of Defense, in fact, by one of my colleagues who was part of AATIP.
And as you go into this, the reason why I wanted to frame it like this is there's so many now. The idea that people would be still trying to delete emails and cover things up, to me, seems almost hard to believe that anyone would be that.
Yeah, I don't think they'd be as foolish now to do what they tried to get away with last time with me. I think the cat is out of the proverbial bag. I think there's enough people now that recognize the reality of this and realize. I mean, look, they've already informed Aero, the organization that was set up to investigate this after AATIP and after the UAP task force, said for the record that these things are real, that they are things in our theaters of combat that are affecting our aircraft in a way that we can't detect them, and they are threatening our airspace and air safety, right? So that's already been stated, not by Luis Elizondo, not by me, by Aero, the organization that's been tasked to investigate this. Plus, there's been a lot of whistleblowers that have come out and testified directly to Congress. I am not at liberty to discuss who those people are, where they work, or what they've seen, but let's just say there are a plethora of individuals that have already come forward, also with top secret clearance, with firsthand accounts of some of these incredible experiences.
When you said already come forward, is that to suggest there's more?
I think there's going to be a lot more. I think this is the wave tops. What the public knows right now is that Congress has been speaking to a few whistleblowers. What the public doesn't know right now is that it's a lot of whistleblowers. And these folks have had direct contact in some cases with this topic and the investigation of this topic for the government going back decades. So you can fill in the blank of what that means.
Well, as I try to follow the topic and as I fill the blanks, there's still questions that come to my mind, and I have to rely on theory. As you know, my background is science. I'm a physicist in my first life.
My background is science too. We have a lot in common.
Which is why we've always got along on looking at this critically. And it's the same with my brother when we first started talking about it. We're both looking at this being like, well, let's explore other realistic options, because tons of people will be Googling now and having a look at the Commander Fravor interviews, and they'll learn all that, and they're going to see for themselves and make their own minds up that we now have so much conclusive evidence that something is zipping around in aerospace doing things that we can't control. And I did, for all of the little kind of physics and science nerds just like myself out there was a lovely little description actually, which I believe may have came from AATIP. I'm sure you can't confirm or deny it. But it was a bunch of scientists that looked at the telemetry data of these moving objects, and they made kind of conservative estimates of what the kind of masses would be, and they looked at the acceleration and the velocities. And for those who haven't seen it, these things are zipping up into 80,000 foot, zipping back down, right?
Yeah, let me emphasize that the videos that are publicly available are certainly not the most compelling. There are videos that we have that are extremely high definition.
But I'm loving that we're getting there, because the first thing I was going to say on this scientific observation is that anyone with a scientific background and an understanding can calculate the energy that would be needed to make an object move like this.
Yeah, especially and then not just visual. Let's not forget that we have radar data, right? Very sensitive, very capable, sophisticated radar systems that can detect a baseball at 80,000 feet. Now, put that into context. When you see an Airbus 380 at 33,000 feet, it still looks like a little speck in the sky. Now, imagine virtually 3 times that altitude and something the size of a baseball. And we can track it with extreme precision, right? So this is the level of fidelity of data that we have on some of these things. So please continue I just want to put that in context as you're talking about the energy levels required to do some of this performance.
This will make sense also, I hope, to my next question. But when you do the maths, we're talking about orders of magnitudes more power than our planet can generate in certain periods of time. Like if you took all of the nukes and kind of detonated them all at the same time, that's the sort of power that we're talking about to move even a much more insignificant mass in these ways. It seems to me that if the maths is correct, and as a scientist you've got to look at this stuff and go, well, it's kind of hard to imagine that being incorrect, and obviously our understanding of physics could be needing an update, or someone could be really far ahead of the time. But we don't have the ability to produce this insane amount of power to do anything like this. It's nowhere near our human capabilities.
Right. Well, so let's put this to somebody who may be sitting in their automobile right now and on their way to work or coming home from work, and it's rainy, and right now we're just kind of speaking generalities. Let's put this into specifics. Imagine taking a small bus, a microbus that you take to the airport, right, when you're going to the terminal or something like that. Take something approximately that heavy as well, and take that object and go from 80,000 feet, and don't just drop it, but force it within less than a second to 50 feet above the ocean, right? From 80,000 feet to roughly 79,950 feet, right? Distance-wise, several miles and miles. And now, imagine that type of energy. Now, do the calculation backwards. Not only were these objects seen coming down, they were also seen going from 50 feet over the water up and beyond 80,000 feet in less than a second. Now, the power output required to do that is more than the entire power generation of the entire continental United States for 3 years. And oh, by the way, whatever power they're using, it's internal to the craft, and it's not an external power source. So these are almost unimaginable levels of energy required to do it. And we are not only picking these objects up, doing this on electromagnetic devices and these things like radar, spy-1 radars, we're also seeing them. Our pilots are seeing them with their own eyes, naked, bare eyes, seeing these things doing and performing these incredible maneuvers that there is no way in heck our country has anything near that technology. The inertial forces alone would crush anything biological inside, would be turned to the consistency of pudding, right? So this is well beyond anything that we are really used to dealing with technologically.
One of the questions that's common when it comes to these things zipping down from 80,000 feet, hanging around for hours, so to speak, out in the ocean. There's so many of them at this point. Why has someone not just trained a high definition camera and just looked at the thing as it's hovering around for quote unquote hours? Why?
How do you know they haven't? Why are you saying no one has?
Just because we haven't seen that yet.
But that doesn't mean no one has. That
so
just means that,
do we have that?
That just means if that's been done, it's probably remained very classified.
Probably remained classified.
So let me hint, nudge, nudge.
Yeah, I'm with you.
It's probably classified, right?
So
to say that it hasn't been captured before, how come other people aren't seeing it? That's not accurate.
So let's say that hypothetically, there were high definition videos of these things as they were hanging around. And let's also say that you clearly cannot confirm or deny that. I would assume that hypothetically, this would be next on your list in terms of applying to have these videos released out to the public domain, like you've already had your successes with the first 3.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it'll scratch the idle curiosity of people out there that want to see something.
For me, strangely, it's not so much about idle curiosity. It's knowing that from my background, teams of scientists, they like to compare. They like to try and run similar
peer review
simulations.
Sure.
They want to try and peer review. They want to see a community that comes to a consensus, not to just be necessarily told or shown something. So for me, the interest is. And maybe this is a good question to twist into, but why are we not exploring having the public domain scientific resource to look at this critically? Why are we not saying, like in the Manhattan Project, when we've got to figure something out, we go and we bring our best minds in. Guys, we've got to fix this problem. This seems serious enough. If we've got invasions of our airspace, we've got these things zipping around and we don't know what they are, right. I would have thought this is just as important to lean on our resource.
And I think we are doing that now. That's exactly why, one of the reasons why it came out, because we needed the best and brightest to look at this. And the original intent of Congress to create Aero was for that purpose. Unfortunately, they haven't gotten there yet. They're only about a year old. They got a new director. It takes time to stand up. Manhattan Project didn't happen a month, right? It took some time. But that's exactly why we need to have this conversation, because a video here too is neat and great, but wouldn't it be more meaningful to create, let's say, I don't know, a national laboratory construct where now we have the national laboratory created to study this with the best and the brightest? That seems to me a lot more valuable than another video hitting the internet. Yeah, the internet, the video's neat and people look at it and say, gee whiz, for a week, and then they go back to, eating popcorn and watching Netflix. That's not the solution. The solution is, as you say, get the best and the brightest to put their minds onto this thing and really try to figure out what the heck is actually going on.
Why do you say that you think we would need laboratories? Do you think there's stuff that people would want to look at in terms of materials? Or?
Well, I think, look, proof is in the pudding, right? Tangible evidence is always very, very valuable, because then you can do a whole other type of study. Right now, you're looking at videos and you're looking at telemetry and speed, velocity, accelerations, and whatnot. When you have material, you can do material science, right? You can do physical analysis, you can do chemical or molecular analysis, and then you can do atomic analysis and really get to the heart, looking at isotopic ratios, for example.
Spectroscopy to find out what is the
Absolutely. And why do certain materials behave the way they do? Because we don't have any material right now that can withstand those forces. So if you have something in your hand that you can look and say, whoa, that is really unique, that can do stuff that our material can't do.
Have you had stuff in your hand?
Unfortunately, I am not at liberty to discuss anything as it relates to potential physical material.
Okay. And then we're back to the...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Okay, fine. But hypothetically, if there were, that might be a good reason to invest into laboratories, because it would allow us to test and maybe confirm or deny whether or not those materials...
physical simulations.
Yeah,
There's one thing to do mathematical modeling on a computer. That's great.
Mm.
Another thing is to actually be able to replicate it in a laboratory.
I understand. And because clearly, at least from my very small experience with material science, we understand how our elements group. We understand how you can change them with temperature. So in the assumption that we had, let's say, exotic materials, do you believe we would be able to run spectroscopy and see kind of non-human origin creations of certain structures, atomic structures and lattices that we just wouldn't know how to make?
Well,
do you think that might be...
let's say hypothetically, let's go down that rabbit hole for a second, so your readers can kind of get an appreciation of just some of the challenges here. There are only so many elements in the universe. Okay? There aren't any new elements, right? And most of these elements are created at the very last stages, the last microseconds of a supernova, going supernova, right? And you have this incredible amount of energy where all these smaller elements combine to create heavier elements, all the way up to uranium. That's universal. But how the atoms are arranged is a whole different story, because it takes a level of precision and technology to arrange atoms so precisely that Mother Nature there's only a certain, if you will, deviation of isotopic ratios within a certain particular type of material or element, right? When you see things where atoms are being arranged so specifically and in a manner which we cannot to this day replicate, we do not have the technology to put this atom precisely like that within a matrix. And on top of that, if you had that technology, to be able to do it at a mass scale would bankrupt any nation, right? That capability does not exist, at least not with our own existing current technology as human beings. So then one must ask the next logical question. Well, we can see it. We know what it's made out of, and we know how it's arranged. Who made it? Who has the technology to create material with that level of specificity? What country has that technology? And then one must ask, well, let's say it's a foreign adversary. Maybe Russia or China was able to figure it out. Well, okay, but that means despite the billions, and I'm going to emphasize this again, billions, not millions, billions of dollars each year our government invests to keep a competitive edge over our adversaries, despite what all the money we give the CIA and all the money we give to NSA and DIA and NGA and NRO and all the other intel agencies, somehow some country has managed to come up with this technology and build something, and something that we had no idea went completely under the radar, right? And on top of that, we're able to now field this technology completely unimpeded in our controlled U.S. airspace, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. This would be an intelligence failure, and I am a product of the intelligence community, so I can tell you this. This would be an intelligence failure eclipsing that of 9/11. This would be the worst intelligence failure this country has ever had, because despite our best efforts, some country managed to develop some technology completely under the radar we had no idea about, spend trillions of dollars developing this technology, and now able to field it into our controlled airspace. And oh, by the way, not just last year, but going back decades. Now think about that for a minute. Think about that scary scenario for a moment.
It is a scary scenario, but when you start to weigh it up against the probability spectrum of having non-human intelligent aliens, interdimensional beings, spacecraft crashing here, there's a fair number of people that would say, well, look, if I'm going to try and roll a dice and figure out what one's more likely, they might steer away from the idea that we have some non-human intelligence, that actually what's happening is, unfortunately, exactly what you say. And I mean, I think it was not that long ago that Elon Musk had come out and said, we will have this Neuralink now. Our first product is, telepathy, which is the fusion of computer chips with the brain, and then you start to think, okay, well, what if there was a foreign adversary that was way ahead of that? Maybe even in our own government and our own operations, we're ahead of that. And then what's to say, my God, what happens with a human mind, an intelligent human mind? What happens when you take an Einstein and you stick a chip in the mind, and then all of a sudden this is Einstein times a billion? How far in such an extremely short space of time you think you throw AI in there? You throw multi-dimensional mathematics in there, you throw quantum mechanics in there, and you start to go, is it actually more likely that we have I'm going to sound like a real conspiracy theorist here. I appreciate that. But is it actually much more likely that we have a foreign adversary that has just managed to leapfrog a little bit and get human brain power massively amplified by AI, massively amplified by machine interference, and actually has cracked a few codes? And the reality of the matter is, yes, these are from Earth. It's just these are extremely cutting edge developments.
So your proposal is that AI was actually developed before 2004, right? That's what you're if you will, postulating and all these other technologies. So let me give you another example here. Maybe it might be helpful. Using Occam's razor principle, I hear it thrown around all the time, right? So let me give you a little from my background, which was microbiology, immunology, and the study of parasites. You may be surprised to know that it was the Greeks, many millennia ago, who really looked at all life forms on Earth and made the observation that there's really only two forms of life. You are either a plant or you are an animal, right? Both are alive, but really structurally and in every other way, really, really different. And then along comes somebody about 300 years ago and says, actually, there's another life form that's been on this planet all along with us that is neither plant nor animal. In fact, it's called fungus. And people said, oh, that's interesting. Wow. Now, Homo sapiens sapien as a species is estimated to be roughly 100,000 years old. So if you look at a 24-hour clock, roughly it's only been the last 4 seconds of our existence that mankind realized we've been sharing this planet with another life form that is neither plant nor animal. And as mind-boggling as that is, it's only been in the last second and a half of our existence that we realize there is another life form on this planet that we've been sharing all along. In fact, if you take all the biomass of every animal and all the biomass of every plant and all the biomass of every fungus and add it all up together, it still will not add up to this invisible biomass that is the true dominant life form on this planet. And what is it? That is the kingdom of microorganisms. Not until we had the technology and could say, little beasties, did we realize the true dominant life form on this planet. The last 100,000 years as a species, we have been living completely oblivious to that fact, right? So I ask you, what's more realistic? Using that analogy, right? As a microbiologist, every time we think we have an understanding of Mother Nature, we can put her in a nice little box, she always finds a way out. Every time, there was a time when I was in school, they said all life forms are derived and get their energy ultimately from photosynthesis. And we took that as a scientific fact. Man, papers and documents and you name it. All that crap came out and everyone was, oh, this is great. We are so smart, pat ourselves on the back. Great job, humans. Then it turns out, well, you know what? Shit, there's this other life form at the bottom of the ocean that live by the black smokers and the heat, and they survive off of something called chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis, and they do quite well. Well, there goes that theory about photosynthesis, right? And then, well, all life forms need to survive and must have oxygen. Well, not true. Anaerobic bacteria do not. Things like botulism, Clostridium botulinum, does not. In fact, it will die in the presence of oxygen, right? And we have these other things called extremophiles that live thousands of feet under the crushing pressure of the Antarctic ice, right? We have life forms we have found on the outside of the ISS, bacteria, that are doing just fine in a zero gravity environment, high radiation environment, no atmosphere environment, right? So we are constantly learning. We are constantly realizing every time we put a limitation on Mother Nature, we are wrong every time. When are we going to learn? In the course of our planet being 4.5, roughly estimated to be by scientists, 4.5 billion years old, right? 4.5 billion years old. And we've been looking for life. We're spending millions of dollars with NASA trying to find microbial life on Mars. We're spending millions of dollars through endeavors like SETI, looking for technosignatures within our own Milky Way galaxy of intelligent life. 4.5 billion years is a long time. What if intelligent life has found us first? Is it possible?
It seems like a emotional response in those moments. Is it something that makes you feel irritated at your government, your team? Because it's a great way of putting it, and I understand fully what you mean, and I'm with you. And the animation and the elevation of your emotion there is really real.
It's hubris. We haven't learned our lesson yet.
Mm.
Every time we think we have the answer, we put on blinders and we refuse to look at what's around us. Look at poor Galileo, the guy almost burned him at the stake for simply observing the solar system and declaring that the Earth was not the center of the solar system. And he had to recant. They refused to even look through his telescope. Now we look back and say that's silly.
Do you feel that there's some similarities? Because there are people that will try and ostracize you and take you down for this stuff. Does it feel like an attack sometimes?
Of course it does, but I try to remember it's not about me, and they're just doing what we do as a species. We've always behaved this way. Anytime someone comes up with a disruptive idea or disruptive evidence to our current paradigm, anything that is introduced to us that forces us to change our existing paradigm, whether real or not, there is always a violent reaction.
We have a lot in common in that sense. With my background, I was very used to being taught one thing as fact. We run the experiments, we understand something. 5 years later, you go to university and they go, everything you learned at school, you kind of got to throw that out because we now have new information.
That's right.
And there's 2 times in my life that I have been left awake at night, and one of them was the double slit experiment, something that will if you follow that and understand that the universe will have different outcomes depending on whether you look at it or not.
That's right.
If you want to think about that long enough, that'll keep you up at night. The other one was learning about you and your work. And I
apologize.
I feel
I'm so sorry.
I feel like that now, honestly, because I feel like you have answers that what I would have wanted more than anything in this world was to break that hard exterior shell that you have about not being able to tell. But I've got to admit, I'm glad to hear the explanation, because you must understand from my position the frustration, and it is a gratification we're after. We do just want to know. We just want to know if we're alone. It's difficult to know that you have this information that you can't tell us. But in that, I have to tap my hat, because I do understand what was it you said before? You said you would rather do things.
Yeah, there's a saying that I have. There's a difference between doing things right and doing things right now. And I think I would prefer to do things right. And in fact, if anything, the last 6-7 years should be an indicator that whatever method we're doing to figure this out is actually working. We're getting people now engaged. We have our government engaged. We have executive branch, the legislative branch. Everybody's now engaged. We have resources going to scientists and organizations in the government to actually study these things, collect the data. So I do believe we are getting to the destination that everybody wants to get to. I understand and appreciate people's impatience. Believe me, if there's anybody impatient, it's me. I am dying to just come out and say blah, 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 and tell everybody what I know. But I know that's not the best way to get to where we want to go. I think those answers, the questions you are asking, will be answered.
How do you think people, hypothetically, if you were allowed to tell everybody everything you know, what do you think the emotional response would be? How do you think people would react?
Let me share with you a very short anecdote. My wife and I raised our children on the Chesapeake Bay, even though I was a Fed in D.C. We wanted to raise our children with some sense of normalcy. so they could ride their bikes in a normal neighborhood, don't have to lock your door. So we lived on a little island called Kent Island in the Chesapeake Bay. And on weekends, we'd go for these family walks by the seaside. And my daughter at the time, Taylor, my oldest daughter, sitting down, she was probably 7 years old, and she says, Daddy, how come that blue crab, Maryland blue crab, we're famous for our blue crabs, why is that blue crab so big and that one down there so small? How does a small one become the big one? And I said, well, Taylor, that big crab was once a small crab. And it has this shell around it, and the shell protects it, and it's kind of like armor and keeps the other fish from nipping at it. But there comes a point in time, once a year, maybe twice a year, where that crab has to break out of its shell. And I'm sure if you were asking the crab at the time, is it uncomfortable? The crab would probably say, yeah, I don't really like this process very much. But it is a necessary process that nature requires in order to grow. Otherwise, if that little crab fails to break out of its crab shell, it will be stunted. That crab shell becomes a prison. It's no longer working to the benefit of the crab. So these moments of these paradigm moments where we must be willing to break open our shell and grow a new one based upon new information, I think is very much in the spirit of the scientific method. And I think it's normal as a species. These paradigm moments don't happen very often in one's lifetime. And that's why it's uncomfortable to have these types of conversations. But as a species, in the lifespan of an entire species, these paradigm moments happen all the time. And in fact, is a natural part of our human evolution. Every time when we, for example, the first time we decided to sail over the ocean blue, that was a paradigm moment. When we first went into space, now, of course, we take it for granted. We have satellites there and we're doing space tourism, right? These paradigm moments don't happen very often, like I said, in one's lifetime, but they are a necessity as a species. If you want to continue to grow and expand and evolve, these are just normal occurrences. You know, there was a time people looked at the moon and they said, oh, witchcraft and look at the moon, it's going to make you sick. Now we realize, no, that's not the case. You're just catching a cold because you're outside late at night and you probably should be sleeping. It's just expanding our understanding of the natural world.
And how willing do you think people will be to let go of their shells? Do you think that the information that you're aware of is going to be something that like, cast off a shell, brand new crab? Or do you think that for many, they're going to stay in their prison?
I think the next generation, once the information is out, people will those who are born to the new paradigm will look at this and say, how silly we were, how dumb, how could we possibly think we were the only ones, right? The problem is it's the generation that's going through the process. That's where you have the friction. That's where the rub comes in, right? And you have all this anxiety and people say, oh, I got to go talk to my therapist because I don't know what to think. Go about your living life. Nothing should change. Change your religion. Don't change your government. Keep paying your taxes. Keep raising your family. Why would you change any of that? Just because your understanding has now been increased doesn't mean you necessarily have to change the way you're living your life. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think that's part of the problem. We think that, every time we come into contact with some sort of new understanding, it's going to revolutionize the way we do things. Well, in some cases it will, but it's not going to change us as a species,
I wanted to explore a few final questions about these actual UAPs. And again, I understand you have to be careful about what you confirm or deny. But one of the things that might worry some, myself probably included here, is that plenty of people have noted a pattern of these craft UAPs interacting with our nuclear systems, missile silos being activated, deactivated, following around nuclear powered craft. How does that make you feel, though? You don't seem fazed. It doesn't seem something bothered. But as someone who is a military man, loyalty is important. The defense of your country is important. To know that there is something coming in, turning on nukes, disarming nuclear capabilities, that must freak you out.
Well, at the risk of having an uncomfortable conversation with some of your listeners, there's two parts of Lou Elizondo. There is Lou, the former national security guy, an intelligence officer. Then there's Lou, the disclosure advocate and transparency advocate. They're not the same person. Okay. People say, well, how can that be? Well, from a military perspective, there's only three options. of intention, right? How do we judge what a threat is? Well, it's a very simple equation. It's capabilities versus intent. We have seen some of the capabilities. We have no idea the intent. So we don't know if it's a threat. So if it or is not a threat, there's only three possibilities. It's either good, it's bad, or it's neutral, right? Can do both good or bad. A lot of people say, well, they're here to good and they're for good reasons. They're here to help us and take matches out of a kid's hand, right, with nuclear weapons. The sad reality is we haven't seen any evidence of that. In fact, if you look at all the development from the atomic age up to the nuclear age to the thermonuclear age, look at the things like Chernobyl, look at the things like Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. UAPs were never there to disable these things. UAPs never stopped these horrible things from happening. UAPs did not stop us dropping bombs in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They did not stop us testing these things in the 1950s in the desert of Nevada. They didn't stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons between Russia and China, the US, Israel, UK, now France, everybody else, right? Iran, Pakistan. They haven't stopped that. What we have seen, however, is what some might describe as ISR. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, because what we do know is that these UAP are interested in our military equities and our nuclear capabilities. So,
and when you say you know that definitively, or it seems that way based on things
no, we have the data of that. We know that.
You know that definitively.
And I'm not going to go into detail of what they're specifically interested in, but military stuff and also our nuclear capabilities and power generation and whatnot, and weapons systems. So with that said, some might, in a national security environment, if I was wearing my national security hat, right, Luis Elizondo, the intelligence officer, I would say that's IPB, initial preparation of the battle space. Someone is doing reconnaissance on us and they want to know our capabilities. Why, right? That's a big problem. Now, that's Lou, the national security guy. Then there's Lou, the disclosure and transparency guy, that says, okay, I can understand that from a national security perspective. That's the lens you're looking at, and that's the lens we pay you to look at, right? We want you to think that way. We want you to keep us safe. But could it be something else, right? I mean, we fly all the time over. I mean, not to make a funny story here, but case in point, you watch any nature show and you watch over the African savanna, the scattering of the wildebeest, right? And there's some dude in a helicopter flying and filming, and one guy takes a dart gun and shoots one in the butt, and then the thing falls over. They go down, they withdraw blood, they make sure they look at migratory, dietary health of the animal right now, take a couple blood samples, put a tag in the ear, and they leave, right? Now imagine from that buffalo's perspective, waking up and all of a sudden going to the water hole and saying, hey, Bill, you're not going to believe this, man, but I just had the craziest thing happen to me, and man, my butt hurts, right? And so they're going to be like, what are you talking about, Bill? Stop drinking from that pond. Don't you know that pond is, you got something there. Go drink from the clean water, will you? There's all sorts of possibilities. And so I'm not one I don't think fear is the right lens. I think curiosity and maybe some concern as to why, but fear I don't think is a proper response.
But what about when we have certain claims coming out that instead of getting shot in the arse with a dart gun, that there may have been much more severe injuries or even death involved in this?
Well, the question is, is it intentional or not? Look, if I go out to any airport right now and I happen to fly out of here and grab a plane, there's no danger, right? But now if I go to that same airplane, I get out of the plane, go on the tarmac, and put my head behind the jet engine while it's throttling up. Well, yeah, there's a big danger. I'm going to get sucked into the engine, or I'm going to get burned, right? Probably not very good for me physically. So, the question is there an intention, right? People say, well, there's a threat. Well, of course there's a threat, but threat doesn't necessarily mean harmful intent, right? They're two different things. Yes, there is a potential threat. If you come up to a technology, a microwave oven that doesn't have the front screen on, you're going to get irradiated. That's just a product of the technology.
And is it something you can talk about, whether or not people have lost their lives or been injured in
We
this?
have, what I can say, because it's already been put out at the unclassified level through several of the research documents that have been released through intelligence agencies, there are a handful, well, unfortunately more than a handful, there are a group of individuals, U.S. service members, that have been affected by UAP technology and having negative medical consequences.
And that's as far as we can go on that topic. Negative medical consequences.
Yeah, I want to be careful. Remember, threat is not necessarily hostile intent. You can have the threat of getting run over by a truck if you cross a freeway without looking, right? But there's no hostile intent behind it, and the two have to be segregated. We can't throw those two in the same bucket.
I think my last question would be, with everything that you know, and trying to avoid putting you in a position.
Okay, first of all, if you ask my wife, she'll tell you I don't know. I know nothing. Okay, so, and my daughter. If you ask my daughter, she'll tell you I know even less than that. So let's just make that clear. Of what I do know, okay.
Of what you do know in a very specific field. You're one of few humans walking this earth that has information in this certain field, and with that information that you have, this top secret information you have, can you tell us what you think the intent is?
First of all, I really appreciate you asking me that question. Secondly, I have to apologize because I can't tell you, and not because I can't because of security clearance, because morally I can't. I don't have enough information to make an educated opinion on. I simply don't, because it can be all sorts of things. And the one thing I learned in intelligence is you can be absolutely sure of something and be absolutely wrong. So I prefer to stick with the facts. What is the data? What does the data suggest? What are we looking at? What's the mathematical models? I'm happy to comment on that. But what you're asking me to do now is go beyond that in the absence of information and data and speculate. And I think it would be very irresponsible for someone like me to do it. I could do it, and there's a lot of people that do. There's this whole topic. If you go on Twitter, God bless, don't do it, but it's a cesspool of people there who have their own ideas, and they are sure it's reptilians or Pleiades and this and that and this and that, and they're here to suck your blood or here to make peace. Who knows, right? I think that's very dangerous. And there's a lot of people making money through a cottage industry of telling people they have the answer when they don't have the answer. And that's the one thing I've always told people. Look, I will tell you when I don't have an answer, it's two reasons, only two. Either it's classified or I don't know. And I will always be honest. I will tell you I don't know when I don't know, and I'm telling you now I don't know.
Well, as we round this up, I can appreciate it, because every time I ask you about many other figures in this space, I appreciate that you always defer to them, that we should listen to them. And you've always spoken, from as far as I can tell, and I'm sure everyone listening, spoken honestly and with loyalty. And I look forward to hopefully doing this again in maybe a couple of years when there's a bit more information out there.
Well, it didn't have to be that long, If we're lucky, if we're successful, you're having this conversation next year.
Well, it has been an honor. Thank you for doing this.
Honor and privilege is mine. Thank you.
Love that.